Now, one of the things that's changed in the unified computing system over the years has been user management, what Cisco terms role-based access control. Fancy terminology for just defining user accounts inside or external to the system, and then giving the particular privileges to those accounts in various parts of the system. Again, Cisco's basically caught up to what you would expect with this functionality in the UCS system. And in this nugget, I'm going to guide you through all of these improvements. So here we are in the UCS system. Of course, we're in the UCSM, the Unified Computing System Manager. And when I tell you the revolution in the role-based access control model of the UCS, you're going to probably scratch your head and say, well, I mean, my goodness, they didn't always do this? No, they didn't, believe it or not. If you slide over to the admin tab, you'll notice there is a user management section on that admin tab. And there is an authentication section. And sure enough, there's native authentication. This is a reference by default to the local user accounts database. And then there are what are called authentication domains, where we could have the authentication take place against remote external stores, probably that we've already set up. For instance, if you're a Microsoft shop, you're going to have an Active Directory. This is a lightweight directory access protocol compliant structure, and it's going to have all your happy little user accounts all set up with all their particular attributes. You can use that to authenticate against the UCS. What's the big revolutionary change here? Well, before you really had to pick one model or the other in the early UCS systems. Were you going to use a AAA environment? Were you going to use a local user account? And it was very rigid. Now it's flexible as you might expect. You can have someone log in, drop down a pick list that's appropriate for them, and they can select the data store that they're going to authenticate against. So you might have a junior administrator that you say, look, you're going to go ahead and authenticate using your Active Directory account, and at the login screen, they're going to drop down their list and they're going to choose the appropriate external store to authenticate against. You yourself might log in using a local user account, and you can choose that at your login. We've got lots more to say about this, of course, but that's the basic overview, and it's probably not a surprise for you at all. By the way, I might as well point out right now that as far as external options go, we've got LDAP, Lightweight Directory Access Protocol, that I've already mentioned. We have Radius, the open standard, and then we have the Cisco proprietary TACACS. So, in fact, that's technically TACACS Plus. So we have the three biggies as far as external authentication sources go. Now, just so you have the full picture here, we also have what we call local. Okay, local authentication. This is often referred to as native authentication with the UCS system. You can kind of see that here, and we often refer to that because the native authentication is tied to the local user accounts database by default. So there's a nice overview for you of this picture of authentication. That's really what we've stressed so far, right? Now, you know that once a user gets authenticated, once their identity is proven, they want to go in your UCS system and start messing things up. This is controlled by authorization. What can that individual do once they're in? Inside our UCS system, as you're going to see in this nugget, we have roles. This is, the like group that they're in. Okay, we don't use the term group in the UCS, but that's what you can think of it like. This is the particular privileges they're going to get based on their role. Now, we can lock that down to only portions of the UCS system. This is done by creating organizations in the UCS and then tying them to the user account and the user account's role using something called a locale. Okay? So, let's make sure you get this picture before we go any further. When it comes to authentication, we can go to a local user accounts database or we can go to an appropriate external database. When it comes to authorization, what we can do, this is going to depend on the role we're in and possibly the locale, which is constructed from our organizational structure we build in the UCS system. Please note that organizations and locales, they're completely optional things. They can be used in conjunction with roles or they can be completely ignored. Well, I think you've got a great foundation for us to explore all of this further. Now, if you are interested in certification, I'm going to need you to go an extra step here, and I'm going to need you to memorize some terminology that Cisco is going to use for this role-based access control model in the UCS system. They're going to use the term protocol realms in order to describe those external sources of LDAP, Radius, and TACACS. When we have a bunch of, let's say, TACACS plus servers, and we want to add them as external authentication sources for our UCS system, they go into a protocol realm called TACACS plus. Okay? By the way, we have local, right? And that is technically a protocol realm as well. So, please know the terminology. You'll need it if you're interested in certification. Now, please understand that inside one of these protocol realms, you are going to create provider groups. Provider groups is where you'll put the individual servers. So I have this LDAP underscore Oshkosh provider group. In that particular group, I'll go ahead and put my particular Active Directory server definition. I might put another one in there for redundancy, of course. Maybe even load balancing of authentications. And now what I have is a provider group inside my protocol realm so that when a particular user is logging in, I can instruct them, hey, from the drop down at login, go ahead and select your LDAP underscore Oshkosh provider group so you can be authenticated against the servers I want you to be authenticated against. So two terms here, protocol realms, and then within them, the provider groups that we create. Okay, so now that we've got some vocabulary under our belt, let's jump back into the UCS Manager interface and make sure that we can apply what we've learned. Make sure that this makes sense. So here we are once again on the Admin tab, and notice I'm in a User Management area. We've been talking and focusing on authentication. Notice there is this authentication node, and within there we have that native authentication. Let's look here. It says default authentication. By default, the realm, remember the concept of the protocol realm? Yeah, the local protocol realm will be used by default for authentication. There's a web session refresh period and web session timeout values that can be manipulated. What about the local console? Well, by default, it's going to authenticate against the local realm. And the role policy for remote users is no login or assign a particular default role. So there's our options here for our native authentication. Now, notice the action that we have available in this node. Yeah, sure enough, from right here, we could create a protocol domain. Yeah, you could create a protocol domain and notice it's for the realm of local, radius, TACACS, or LDAP, those possible protocol realms that we have. Now, if we go down to the LDAP area, right? one of the things that we would see on the general tab for the LDAP protocol realm is sure enough the ability to create an LDAP provider group. So we can create a new provider group as I described, and inside that group you can create a new LDAP provider. And this screen will go through, but as you might guess, it's where you would go ahead and assign a particular server's credentials that you're going to use for authentication purposes. So this is a great exercise to hear the theory, to get our new vocabulary under our belt, and then come in and actually see how that is implemented in the user interface. Now let's talk about authorization, what we can do once we're successfully inside the system. This, as you might guess, is going to be under user services. And one of the things that we can do on user services is say, look, I want to take a look at my locally authenticated users. What is my local database looking like? All right, first of all, notice there's a password strength check that's in place. There's particular password profile things like when can they change it, etc. A password policy, which is nice. And then here's our default admin account. If we expand this account, we will see the roles that account is part of. Remember what we said about roles. They give us our particular privileges. Notice the default admin is in the role of admin and role of read-only. Well, what can these roles do? Well, sure enough, we have a roles node here. And if we double click, or actually single click, let's see, we're going to expand the node and then click admin. There we go. We can see the admin role gets a particular special privilege of admin. Oh my goodness, that's the only particular privilege it has, and that means it can do it all. That's right, the default admin account, which you can't delete, is that account that can literally do everything in the entire UCS system. It makes sense that this particular account would exist. What other role was it in? It was in the read-only role. And sure enough, if we scroll down here, we see there are no particular privileges assigned to that particular role. Now, another aspect of the UCS system that we mentioned was locales. And locales are based on organizations. Let's look at this. If we go over to the servers tab, we notice that there is this root organization, and then there are these potential sub-organizations. And here in the emulator, they have created one for you to give you an idea about it, and that sub-organization is the finance sub-organization. What you can do is you can create a locale based on this organization. So you could have a person that's in charge of security settings just for things that fall under finance. So an interesting way to further refine the privileges that a particular individual has in your UCS system. Now, note, when we created, or when the emulator designers created the finance sub-organization, that automatically gets recognized across all of your structure, right? So if we go into sub-organizations on the LAN tab, sure enough, we have a finance. If we go over to the SAN tab and we go to our organizations, sure enough, we have finance. So we can create the organization structure and it gets implemented across all of our major configuration areas. Now, how organization works is through an inheritance process. Let me diagram this for you. So we have what's called the root organization. This has to exist. It can never be deleted, as you might guess. And then we might go in and we might create a sub-organization called US. And then in there, we might do the Florida sub-organization and then the New York sub-organization. Then we could create another one called EU. And in there, we could do Italy. And in there, underneath that, we could do, some other European sub-organization. How about Portugal? Now, oh, that's interesting. I just got my two genetic inheritance properties there. All right, so let's think about this now. If you have some particular thing that is assigned to New York, let's say it's a particular policy, that policy will try and work its magic in New York, but it can look for resource availability up the hierarchy as well. Could something assigned to New York go over here and try and pull resources from Portugal? No, absolutely not. So there is an inheritance flow where the particular objects can go up to the root, but they can't go down another branch of the organizational structure. And we'll see examples of this as we get more involved in the UCS system later on, but I just wanted to kind of impress that upon you now, and it makes good common sense that the inheritance process would work this way. Remember, when we have this organizational structure and we want to tie it to authorization, remember how we do that? We do that through the creation of locales. That's how we can tie this organizational structure into our permissions model. So now what I'd like to do is have some fun. Let's create a new user account and let's see what happens. So I'm going to go over to my admin tab and I'm going to go over to user services and I'm going to go to locally authenticated users, and over here on the right I'm going to go to our plus button. Sure enough, this brings up the create user screen. All right, I'm going to go ahead and create a login ID of CompSolve, and this is for my brother who I always use in my classes, John Sequeira. Poor guy. And his email is johns@gmail, let's say. And his phone is 505-555-5555. And his password is going to be something super secret that matches the complexity rules. His account status, is he active or inactive? He's going to be active. Notice inactive is something that we can do to temporarily disable his account. His account will still stay in the database, of course, but he cannot use it in order to interact with the system. Notice by default, there is no account expiration. You might be wondering why I'm going through so carefully all of these options. You need to know all of these options in the certification exam environment. Probably should have said that at the very beginning of the nugget. Cisco is going to hammer you on the contents of this nugget in the certification exam environment. Be ready. So by default, no account expiration. By default, our account is active. That's great. And notice, this really brings together what we were discussing. We can put John Sequeira in a particular role. And notice if we're using locales based on our organizational structure, we can limit his power to a particular locale. So let me say I want him doing stuff that's in operations. I'll put him in that particular role. Notice read only is grayed out. What does this tell us? Yeah, everybody gets read only. Yes, everyone gets read-only privileges in the UCS system by default. Interesting. So I'll go ahead and put him in the operations role. Password required for SSH, or are we signing a key? We can set that up. We say OK, and we have just created a user account, except, wow, the password creation policy is really strict, so I need to do some upper and lower case in addition to the letters and numbers that I did. Let's try that. And Oh my gosh, I had a dictionary word in there. Boy, we love to see this, don't we? So let me do another one of my passwords. And let's see if I got that right. And we created that user account successfully. We say OK, and now we have our CompSolve user account. Now you might say, all right, Anthony, you went in and you made that entity a member of the role operations. What can operations do? Well, we'll just click down here on the operations role and you will see the particular privileges it gets. Not much. It's in a privilege called fault and a privilege called operations. Click on that and it will give you a brief description. We can do logs, we can do the call home feature. Same with fault, you'll get a brief description, alarms and alarm policies. Where would you go for the additional detail that you're really going to want over those particular privileges and exactly what they do? Well, of course, you're going to go to the Cisco online documentation we navigated to, and I gave you a sense for that in an earlier nugget of this course. So, great stuff. The ability to assign privileges to our user accounts through these roles. But I know what you're thinking. You want to be able to create your own role, don't you? Sure, potentially you want to be able to do that. So, geez, would it be this easy? Could we go to roles and could we click the plus sign in order to create a role? Absolutely, it's that easy. I'll just do sample. Let's see, I'll do sample hyphen security. And you could go in here and select all of the particular privileges that have to do with security. And now you've just created a role, and I'll just pick a few more here, that is customized for the security privileges that exist in the UCS system. And obviously, if you wanted to go in, we go to user services here, we go to the CompSolve user, you could edit this user that you created and get them in that custom role very easily so that they take on those new privileges that you've grouped together. Now, I would be very, very at fault here if I didn't walk you through the organization process. After all, you may want to use the organization concept and the locale concept. So go to any of your tabs because remember the organizations are available there. And what I'll do is I'll click on the root and notice in the actions here we have create organization. By the way, another way to go in the UCS system is to right-click root and choose create organization from the shortcut menu. I'll say we want the Americas organization. You could add an optional description. Notice we just created the Americas sub-organization. Great. Now, if we go back over to our admin, we have the locales area. I'll choose the add locale and we'll say, all right, this is going to be the Americas locale. All right, there we go. I'll say next. And you know what? I'm going to actually go back and say Americas underscore locale because after all, it is a unique concept from the Americas organization. Now we have our organization's hierarchy here. And sure enough, there's our Americas. So what I'll do is drag this over and make sure that the Americas organization is set up there. And let's see if we did that correctly. I want to make sure we did that correctly. Okay, so there we go. We have the Americas locale, which is linked, of course, to the organization called Americas under the root. Perfect. I'll say finish. And it says, okay, you successfully created the Americas locale. And that Americas locale, of course, is based upon the organization called Americas. Great stuff. So now we want to further restrict the John Sequeira user account. So I'm going to go to my locally authenticated users, and I'm going to go to our CompSolve user and I double click it to go in its properties, we can see all the wonderful properties that we set up. And now we are going to go in and say, look, John, you have read only everywhere, but as far as operations privileges, you are only going to have those over things that are in the Americas locale. So now we have further enhanced the authorization system of our UCS environment. Now, by the way, since we're sitting right here, this is a great point for us to go ahead and review something critical. We have this CompSolve user account, and we know that it has the operations role in the Americas locale. So we have root, and then we have this structure called Americas. This particular user account has operations privileges here and would get those privileges in any sub-organizations that we create below it. What happens when this account goes up to the root, or when this account is trying to interact with something in another branch? You guessed it, it's read-only privileges that it has. So the only place it's going to get its privileges assigned by roles are in its locale and things below its locale, organizational structures below its locale. Make sure you're familiar with how this model works. Now, how I want to wrap up this particular nugget is obviously with some final exam material, but for our demonstration portion here, let's just walk through the adding of an external particular provider, right? And let's make sure we put that provider in a particular group. I like to start with the group concept. So we go in and we say like LDAP underscore NY. Okay, and we're going to say okay, and we're going to create the LDAP NY provider group. Now you can go in and actually create a provider. So I could say there's one out there at 10, 10, 10, 1. Order, what order do we want to use these servers in the particular provider group that we're going to add this to? Nice, so you can select the order of usage for the different servers. Notice there's a bind distinguished name. This is the distinguished name of the LDAP object that will perform the username and password lookup in the particular database. So you're going to put the distinguished name for the LDAP user account. That's going to be like in the form CN equals UCS underscore LDAP, the common name that we're utilizing. It's going to be the common name of users. And you can check with your LDAP staff, right? Your LDAP administrators for all this information. DC equals Cisco. I'm just putting some information in here to get us through, and then DC equals COM. So you put in the distinguished name for your bind distinguished name, and then a base DN is the DN for our super user account. So CN is going to be, common name is going to be equal to users, and DC Cisco DC COM. DC equals Cisco equals COM. And I might need spaces. We'll see if it lets me get away with this. The particular port number, whether or not we're going to use SSL, a filter which will allow you to restrict LDAP searches, an attribute. This is the particular attribute that stores the values for the user roles and locales. And by default, we often use member of for this. And then the particular password that is going to be used in order to give us access to the LDAP store. So I'll put that in. Timeout value, whether we're using OpenLDAP or Microsoft's Active Directory for the vendor-specific stuff. Looks like we did all that right. Great. And now we have our LDAP group rule. What's happening here is our ability to select whether we want authorization to follow from the LDAP membership, and if we're going to search up the tree or not in the LDAP structure for this particular user account that's linked by the value of member of. So we can make the appropriate selections here. Again, consult closely with your LDAP administrators, and we'll click Finish. We just created the 10-10-10-1 LDAP provider. Awesome. Now we have our LDAP provider group, and that's LDAP_NY. I just double clicked it, and in this particular group, we're going to add our 10-10-10-1 provider that we created. So very simple stuff. We now have the LDAP LDAP_NY provider group. We now have our LDAP provider entry within that particular group. I just wanted to walk you through the mechanics of that. Obviously, you will need to work with your LDAP administrators for the fine, detailed settings of the LDAP integration. And something that you'll probably get involved with them is mapping. Yeah, is doing group maps. Let me explain this. In the LDAP world, right, we have, if I could spell that, in the LDAP world, we have the concept of groups. In the UCS world, we have the concept of roles. So what an LDAP group map is just the mapping that is coordinating the groups to the roles. And this is important if we're wanting the groups of LDAP to dictate the authorization inside the UCS system. You remember that checkbox a moment ago that we could utilize in order to have LDAP group membership drive authorization privileges in UCS. So if we want to go through that, we would set up LDAP group maps to appropriately map groups to roles inside the UCS. I won't bother to demonstrate it. It's a simple wizard-based process. And again, you'll be working very closely with your LDAP administrators on this. So here we go. It's final exam time in this nugget. Which of the following statements about the RBAC system and UCS are true? It's our job to find two that are true. I'm a poet and I didn't even know it. All right, let's check it out. A user assigned to multiple roles receives the union of all privileges. So if I take a user account and I put them in like the operator role, and then I create some custom security role, would they get all the privileges that are in each of those roles? Absolutely they would. I love it. B, a new user account in UCS expires in 30 days by default. We saw that's not true when we were in the interface together. C, local accounts override external accounts by default. No. When a user's logging in, they're going to indicate where they're logging into in a drop-down menu, and that's going to be that. Yeah. D, an operator role user account in the Americas will have read-only access to the root and all sub-organizations. I'm so glad that's true because we were in a choose two situation and it's the only answer left. Yeah, remember, we have all user accounts have read-only access to everything in the UCS system. Congratulations on your fine work in this nugget. I hope this nugget was informative for you, and I'd like to thank you for viewing.